So in my last workshop, I was talking about organizational chemistry, and it was a vast topic. The question was, how does organization and team structure help communication? How does it help people to get along? That topic is literally a Pandora box. So I had to go back to my library, start getting back the original science that we have on this topic, because it's at the moment subject to a lot of fashions and trends around how we should structure things. With the fact that we've had the COVID, we've had a lot of shifts in organizational structures recently, plus the whole DEI trend, which is fabulous, but also bringing a lot of new ways of thinking about how we organize our work and hierarchy, power, and so on. So I thought I'd do a summary in a doodle format for you on this topic and give you like a really simplified high-level view of what we know today from science on that topic. Now, who's this for? A lot of HR managers are interested in this topic. Also, people who design organizations, consultants, leaders, obviously, who need to adapt their leadership to the different structures that they have in their organization. We're looking at the meso, which is team, and we're looking at the macro, which is like organization structures and so on. So we're looking at those two levels in this video. And if you want to stay to the end, you got the references. I'll give you all the books and the things that might help you go further. It's a topic that's prone to misunderstanding because of culture, because of where we come from. Initially, everybody comes from a particular culture, and we have a natural preference of structure in our communication, which kind of makes us less objective on this topic. So let's think of a group of people. Obviously, it's very complex. People don't just behave in a way that is rational. Unfortunately, for engineers and organizational designers, it's not as simple as just taking a structure like the org charts that you see everywhere with power. So back in the 1940s, when they started studying this properly, the very first line experiments, like in a restaurant where you have the waitress that comes, picks up the order, then you have the runner from the kitchen goes to the chef. There's broken telephone, and we know that it's difficult for the chef to negotiate. So that linear structure is not enough, even though that's the baseline of how people tend to communicate. The very first in history that emerged is the circle. In a company, that might be the board, the council, or in some more progressive companies, they have already circles for different topics. And they're really useful to align on, for example, purpose. They're also very common in what we call teal organizations. It cannot solve all communication needs. The second one, it used to be called the why, and it's often called the hierarchy. It's pretty much a triangular structure where you have a person, or usually it's two people. If you look at it from reality, it's usually at least two people, one looking at task and one looking at emotional management of a group. A typical example of that would be a project team. In some countries, the idea of hierarchy is directly colliding with the cultural values of equality. So there's a misunderstanding around that, which is that what I'm talking about here is not a fixed hierarchy, but it's a natural, organic hierarchy where people can shift roles. So in a sense, like in our team here, when Anu and I and Jonas work together, we can shift. One takes the lead on this, one takes the lead on that. It's not a person, it's a role that has a hierarchy, and that's a confusion that often leads to misunderstanding and conflicts. So hierarchy. Then there is the matrix, which has evolved a lot in the corporate world, and that's where you bring a certain amount of structure into the way people communicate horizontally and vertically, and that's very good for stabilizing. The other one is actually good for implementing, getting things done. Okay. An example of a matrix will be typically support teams in organizations where you might have, for example, the HR department might be organized in a bit of a matrix across all the company to support the other teams. Then you have the network. The network is obviously going to be very dependent on internet. And even before the internet, that structure was identified as a very interesting one to help understand, share information and knowledge. A good example of that is an expert community of practice. For example, in a company like a consultancy, you might have the designers and the developers as two different networks of experts. Any social media network, you'll find Slack channels, things like that. And then you have the one that is very often pointed to as bad, but in a way it is useful in certain cases, called the wheel. And it's essentially when you have centralized authority, and that is very common in highly chaotic environments, conflicts, when there's a crisis, for example. And that's where you see it's individual leaders who take that posture in the middle of the black dot. It could also be entrepreneurs in a startup environment, or intrapreneurs where they are actually looking at how to actually structure that chaos when everything is unclear. So it's good in a moment of uncertainty. So those are the basic formations. Now, of course, there's a lot more to it. So I'm going to go through this, and if you want to just skip to the end and look at the conclusions I'm going to get here, go ahead, put some time codes in the links of the video. Now, the first thing we look at is satisfaction. I think that's one of the reasons why people often prefer one of those models is clearly that the circle is very high satisfaction. Now, these are measures that are taken from different social scientists. If you start looking into the literature, you'll see sociograms, communigrams, power dynamic measures. There's fantastic stuff being done already since the 1940s on this, well before the internet started. This is satisfying. It's very motivating. It's something that creates a sense of flow for the participants very easily. So satisfaction is one of the outputs of having a circle. Now, in the hierarchical, it's slightly less. It's moderate satisfaction according to the literature. The matrix is even less, it's quite low, and the network is very high, which perhaps explains why people love being on networking events. And then in the wheel is quite low in satisfaction because it's generally associated with times of crisis and uncertainty, which very few people enjoy. So if we look at purpose, now by purpose I mean aligning the shared meaning with a team. Everybody has their own meaning that they give to a particular team formation or work project, but what I'm talking about is the collective purpose, the shared purpose that unites people and makes people feel motivated to do their job beyond getting their intrinsic motivations sorted and their pay. I'll draw here the symbol for cognitive science to denote that this is about meaning. Very high capacity for aligning on purpose on the circle. That's probably the main reason why one would want to use a circle formation. In hierarchy, you still can, particularly when you have clear leadership. Same thing with a matrix, but a network is pretty poor at aligning. See in social media where it's a bit all over the place. And in the wheel, it's not at all. So again, you start to see that there is no perfect way. Every single form has its pros and cons and uses. If we look at tech, and I'm talking about accessibility, so in the context of DEI, this is going to be linked to the needs, and I'm talking specifically the equity of needs of access that people would have. Some often want to have a one-size-fits-all tech to deal with communication. Unfortunately, it's not possible. But here, the circle is good with synchronous communication, so that means live. Online, that could be a Zoom call with everybody able to talk, with some space and time for people to talk. In a live, that could be a circle of chairs, non-hierarchically organized. In terms of the hierarchy, these are typically scoping tools for communication. So scoping and planning. Now that could be, for example, Monday, Asana, Trello, those kind of tools for working online. In the matrix organization, to stabilize things, you'd be wanting to look at measuring tools, reporting tools, time tracking tools, for example. Then on the network, it's generally social media, wikis, like using Confluence, micro knowledge bases. And in the wheel formation, that's generally, in terms of communication tools, push tools. Like you look at RSS feeds, or if you have a crisis, you get a tweet come in, it's a one-way channel, and it's usually very simple information that's being communicated as a push. In terms of technological access, again, you're not going to be using the same tools in these formations. It starts to create a bit of a mess in the organization. So it's not about having one better than the other. They're all relevant in some way. And the best performance for each of those is going to be based on, this is where it gets really abstract, on the state of the organization that you're in at that point in your project or company growth. So there's a lot of work done on that by Snowden on the Cinefin model. Also, Bengtson, Stian and Williams have been looking at that with their entrepreneurial capital book. Complex systems, complex situations are going to be generally working well with circles. When you look at simple situations with our very high predictability, like for example, you've got a product line and you're running with that product and everything's already clear, it's great to use hierarchy. Complicated systems. Now, you're probably thinking, what's the difference between complicated and complex. Think of complicated as a machine, complex as a living organism. Complicated, the sum of parts can be distilled down in nuts and bolts of an aeroplane. You can predict what's going to happen by looking at the parts. So typically machines, robots, tech, coding is complicated. Complex is like a bowl of spaghetti. You don't really know when you pull one how everything is going to move. It's completely unknown and it's very hard to predict. Probably in the future AI will be able to predict that, but for the moment complex is one step above in terms of challenge level. So in matrix setups, you can have lines of accountability sideways in measuring the performance, and you can build dashboards if you're liking that kind of measurability. Then in network, it's typically in the state of chaos. So is the wheel formation. When there's chaos, there's a high degree of uncertainty. In some cases, if it's not even known whether you're in complex, simple, complicated, or chaos, then generally that wheel comes in as a little moment. If you followed the video we did on different stages of team formation, you need different ways of communicating, different ways of leading. Coaching leadership doesn't work at every stage. That last one here, when it's very unstable, very uncertain and chaotic, it might be that moment where you do need that strong leader to come in and give some direction to help get out of that chaos and start getting the group towards a functional conflict that moves trust forward and builds dynamics of team. Then in terms of speed and agility, you have response to change. Like, how do you respond to change? As a team, as a group of people, the circle is actually not very good. The hierarchy is pretty good. The matrix is unknown. I don't have data on that one. Then you have in the network, that one is also why you see in Twitter the first news coming in before some reporters even get it. If you want to really put your finger on the pulse of rapid change in media, you'd look at social media channels. So the networks are very good at that. So is the wheel setup. Having a sort of strong leader in the middle who's directing outwards to others information in a time of PR crisis. That's actually quite a useful model to have in your pocket as an organization. Then you have accuracy. The circle is not very good at accuracy. If you're trying to write a statement or if you're trying to detail design something, or you're trying to get some very good quality specs in development work, circles are generally not going to be very useful. The best in that case is to have a clear division of roles with some kind of hierarchy to it so that people are clear about who's doing what. This one, no data. Network is pretty okay. Again, this centralized one, even though we tend to dislike that model, it's actually very good for accuracy. So you could imagine, instead of being people around, you could put lots of tools and bots. And you, as a single entity leader, for example, or entrepreneur, you have a very high degree of accuracy. If you have all the right expertise around you, you're in the center. Last one is leadership emergence. I was wondering how to write this one to not get it misunderstood. Emergence is when often people think of a leader in the old-fashioned sense of a autocrat, top-down, quite dominating figure. First of all, there's a myth. If you look at real social dynamics in many different studies, you'll find that actually what naturally emerges as leadership is really the difference between people acting for their individual interest or their common interests. When somebody is acting for the common good of the group, to help the group move forward in their task towards solving problems, making decisions, things like that, they are naturally taking what one would call a leadership role. Leadership emergence occurs. When a person is more expressing, venting, asking questions for their own account, that's not leadership, that is participation. So that's how I'm defining leadership emergence here, is that it's somebody who is acting not out of personal interest to dominate, but actually acting out of collective interest. For leadership emergence to occur, of course, you can get individuals to co-lead the circle in turn. Each person talking can be a leader of the circle at that moment of talking, but that's quite advanced. That's the art of hosting circles and advanced practitioners. But generally, the circle doesn't help the leader emergence. The hierarchy doesn't help that much either, neither does the matrix, and certainly not the network. The main benefit of having that wheel formation is to help bring up some leadership. It's like somebody at some point has to step up to help the process move forward. And generally when it's not codified or structured, it creates conflict. You can see now that there's quite a lot of different value in each of those. If we summarize it, the circle is really great to align on shared purpose. The hierarchy And again, I'm emphasizing that it's not one person at the top. It can be a rotating hierarchy based on jobs and decision making. Get things done is really the promise of that one. When I see a group of people who are not getting things done, generally they're in a circle. Then the matrix one is good for optimizing and increase accountability. In places where you have a lot of finger pointing and people not taking responsibility for what's going on in a highly unstable environment, they're lacking that to help them stabilize their communication and work. The network is great for rapid share and knowledge. And the last one, in a way, is good for announcements. I've seen some seal organizations that do that, where they have this ritual that every week the CEO who's making a very simple open question with some reflection and dialogue, that it's also useful when you have tensions and uncertainty, good conflicts or the bad ones. Now, if there is a conflict, generally you need a moment of somebody stepping in and taking charge to be able to get people unstuck from that. That's usually the mediator. Now, when you don't have a mediator, it's the job of the individual participants to step in and do that, whether it's the leader, the manager, or even one project team member. Sometimes it is helpful, and that hits extra resistance because people tend to assume that when you take over for that process, you're doing it out of personal reason rather than to help the group. So when that happens, note to self, mention why the intention matters. I'm taking over because I'm helping us to move through this uncomfortable conflict so that we can get things done, for example. So that's what I have now on how do we get along? How do we build the different structures to help us communicate? If you want to get a bit more, this is one of my favorite textbooks. A lot of the things that I showed you here are taken from the chapter 8, which has got a massive amount of interesting things like communigrams, sociograms, and it shows how much work has already been done before things like team building was becoming fashionable. Then, of course, there's the inevitable Snowden work on the Sinefin model. If you want to look at complex, simple, complicated chaos, he has done some very foundational work on this. And you also find this in the entrepreneurial mindset of Albert, Brigitte, and Roland's work within the topic of corporate innovation and teams. So if you're an agile coach, this is really interesting as well. And they have a model that with where the conflicts occur, the sort of the difficult moments of transfer, how these formations intertwine over a project lifecycle. If you're really into practice, I would highly recommend you looking into the art of hosting. This is a global movement. Some are more active than others. This is the copy of their workbook from the Finnish art of hosting. This is really hands-on practice. It's one thing to talk circles, triangles, and matrices, but when you actually have to run a group of people and you want to get out of that linear mode of thinking that we have in most companies, they have useful tools that you can look at that help you do that on a flip chart in the meeting and start working in different ways. If you're also interested as a manager in organizations, that's one of my favorite books. I often bring it as a gift because it's so useful. It's like full of little examples of these 21st century organizations that are having an evolutionary purpose, dropping the ego and having a higher degree of autonomy. This book is one of the introduction books that I think is most useful. Plus, they have resources like how to measure where you are as an organization. You can do this by downloading their worksheets. Useful if you're an HR manager to look at this. If you like newsletters, Joost and Pim in Holland, they've got an incredible growing community around how to do in practice. So examples of how do you build a payroll system that has the circular structure or whatever. There's lots of candy in there. They've got a book, they've got an online course. If you're still looking for more food for thought and references, just drop me a comment below, and the usual, just share and subscribe. And I will be adding all of the links of what we talked about here into the bottom of this video. May your organizational building be successful.